The October wind came down off the ironbark range like a thing with teeth. It rattled the windows of the cabin and bent the pines until they groaned. And inside the cabin, the lamp flame jumped with every gust, as if it understood that something was coming for the people gathered in that room. Adelaide Penhallow knelt beside the man she had married 3 months ago. Her hands were red to the wrist with his blood. The bullet had passed through his left hip and lodged somewhere none of them could reach. And the blanket she pressed against the wound had already gone the color of wet earth. Rhett Brockway lay on his back on the sawn pine boards, breathing through his teeth. His right hand wrapped around her wrist with a grip that felt like iron heated in a forge. "You do not run," he said. His voice was low and even. "Promise me." She looked down into eyes the color of polished brass, and she did not flinch. "I am not running," she said. "I am going to shoot the next man who comes through that door." By the window, Ridge Brockway had his back pressed against the chinked logs, one arm hanging useless at his side, where a piece of lead had punched clean through the meat of his shoulder. His other hand held a Colt Navy revolver, and he was thumbing the hammer back with the practiced calm of a man who had done it 1,000 times. Asher Brockway was crouched at the loophole cut into the front shutter, the long blue barrel of a Sharps rifle resting in the notch, his cheek laid against the wood as if he were listening to it speak. "5 men out there," Asher said. "Maybe 6. Ransom Falk is calling out a price on her." A voice came up from the tree line. It carried over the wind like something practiced for the carrion. "Miss Penhallow, your daddy sold you twice. Your daddy is gone now. Nobody is keeping the door locked anymore." Adelaide lifted the heavy Sharps rifle that Asher had loaded for her and laid the barrel on the windowsill. She closed her left eye and lined the bead on the place where the voice had come from, and her hands did not shake. 3 months ago, her hands had shaken when she stepped down off the stagecoach in Pinewood Gulch. They had shaken when she signed her name in the parish register. They had shaken when a man twice her size kissed her on the forehead in front of a town that had come to watch her be devoured. They were not shaken now. She squeezed the trigger. The cabin filled with smoke and thunder, and somewhere out in the dark, a man cried out, and the screen of the world went black. 3 months earlier. Philadelphia. The summer of the centennial year. The boarding house on Fitzwalter Street smelled of cabbage and damp brick, and Adelaide Penhallow climbed the narrow stair with a tin pail of broth held carefully in front of her, so as not to spill a drop. She was 20 years old that July. She was thin in the way that women get when they have been given away their share of the supper for a long time, and her brown hair was pinned up in a way that her mother had taught her plain and tight, the way a woman wore her hair when she had work to do, and did not want her hair to argue with her about it. In the upper room, Aunt Marigold lay against 3 pillows, and the rattle of her breathing filled the small space the way a clock fills a hallway. The girl ladled broth and held the spoon, and the old woman drank what she could and turned her head away from what she could not. Then her thin hand came up and caught Adelaide by the wrist with surprising strength. "Listen to me," she said. "Your father has written you again. The letter came this morning. I tried to burn it. I could not lift the matches." Adelaide found the letter on the washstand. She knew her father's hand the moment she touched the envelope. Once it had been a beautiful hand, the careful copperplate of a man who had served as a scout for General Philip Sheridan in the long burning autumn of the Shenandoah. Now, it was a drunkard's hand, the letters falling sideways as if they had given up on standing. Ezra Penhallow wrote to his daughter from a place called Pinewood Gulch in the Colorado Territory. He wrote that he owed a man named Bartholomew Driscoll the sum of $5,000. He wrote that Mr. Driscoll had been generous enough to suggest that the debt might be settled in another currency. The currency was Adelaide. Mr. Driscoll required a young woman to keep his house, the letter said, and if she came west on the next stagecoach, the debt would be forgiven, and her father would be permitted to live. Do not come. Ezra wrote at the bottom of the page. The ink there was smudged in 3 places where his hand had betrayed him. Do not come, my girl. He will not keep you for housework. But if you do not come, he will kill me. I have sat at this table for an hour now, and I cannot find another way to say it. I am sorry. I have always been sorry. Your loving father, Ezra Penhallow. Adelaide stood at the window of that boarding house with the letter pinched between her fingers, and the long evening light came in across the city of Philadelphia and laid itself down across the iron beds and the chipped washstand, and she thought of her mother. Lavinia Penhallow had been a thin woman with very blue eyes and a way of speaking that made even the schoolmaster lean forward in his chair when she explained something. She had taught her daughter to read at 4. She had taught her arithmetic before her 7th birthday. Every morning while she braided Adelaide's hair, she had said the same thing. Knowledge is the only firearm a woman is permitted to carry every day of her life. Carry it loaded. Lavinia had been dead 5 years. The fever had taken her in 11 days, and the day after the funeral, Ezra Penhallow had come home from a tavern with the smell of whiskey on him, and he had never quite come home all the way again. Adelaide folded her father's letter in half. Then she folded it again. Then she walked downstairs to the boarding house parlor, where the old men kept the morning newspapers stacked on the sideboard, and she found the Philadelphia Public Ledger, and she turned to the page where the men advertised for wives. Most of the listings were soft and full of poetry. Lonely widower, God-fearing farmer, comely temperament desired. She read past those without slowing. She was not looking for poetry. She found the listing she wanted near the bottom of the column. It was 4 lines long. Mountain Ranch needs a wife who can work. Will provide supplies safety a roof. Train fare and stagecoach refunded on arrival. Reply to R. Brockway, Pinewood Gulch, Colorado Territory. She read it 3 times. There was no promise in it. There was no sentiment. There was only a man telling her that if she came, he would feed her and keep a roof over her head. And the absence of any other promise felt like the first honest thing she had read all month. She wrote her reply that night by candlelight. She received an answer 12 days later. The answer was even shorter than the advertisement. It was 3 lines in a square, unlovely hand that looked as if the man had learned to write late and had refused ever after to make his letters pretty. Come on the stagecoach to Pinewood Gulch. Wear something you can travel in. I will know you. The signature was a single initial, R. She left Philadelphia on the 3rd Tuesday of July. Aunt Marigold gave her a Bible and a silver wedding ring that had been her mother's. From the bottom of an old pine chest, she also drew out a small bronze medal on a faded ribbon, and she pressed it into Adelaide's palm. Your father earned this in 1864, the old woman said. General Sheridan pinned it to his coat himself at Cedar Creek. He was a different man then. Carry it with you. Maybe it will remind him who he was if you ever see him again. Adelaide put the medal in the pocket sewn inside her traveling dress, and she boarded the cars at the Broad Street depot. And she did not cry until the train was past the last brick chimney of West Philadelphia. And even then she cried with her face turned to the window, so that the older woman in the next seat would not see her. The stagecoach rattled into Pinewood Gulch in the long honey light of a Colorado afternoon. The town was smaller than she had pictured, even smaller than the village she had grown up beside, just one dust street, with a saloon and a sheriff's office, and a white clappered church, and a livery stable and a general store. And behind the town, the ironbark range rose up like a wall the color of iron held in the fire. She climbed down with her valise in both hands, and her navy blue traveling dress gone the color of pewter from the road, and she looked for R. Brockway. She had built a picture of him in her head on the train, a middle-aged farmer with a sunburned neck, a widower perhaps, kindly and shy, who had sent for a wife because he was lonely and could not court a woman properly out here so far from any town worth the name. What she saw across the street froze her where she stood. 3 men stood in front of the general store, not 3 ordinary men, 3 mountains made of leather and shoulder bone. They stood a head taller than every other living thing on that street, and their stillness made the wooden buildings behind them look like children's toys laid out for a game. The man in the center had a scar that ran from his left eyebrow down past his cheekbone and into the line of his jaw. It was a brutal scar, the kind that came from a piece of metal moving very fast, and the scar pulled the skin slightly, so that even at rest his face wore an expression of bleak watchfulness. His eyes, even from across the street, were the color of brass that had been polished and then handled by working hands. A long single-shot rifle hung on a leather sling across his shoulder, as if it had grown there. The man on his left was a touch softer in the face, with a leather-bound book under his arm, but built like a draft horse given human form. The man on his right was the youngest auburn hair catching the last of the daylight leaning forward on the balls of his feet, with the loose readiness of a man who had spent years in places where being slow was the same as being dead. He wore 2 pistols, one on each hip. All 3 of them were looking directly at her. The town had gone quiet. Somewhere behind her, a woman whispered, "That's the one. The mail order. Lord have mercy on her, does she know there are 3 of them? Who in God's name sends a girl out to the Brockways of Ironbark?" The scarred man stepped down off the boardwalk and crossed the street to her. Each of his boot falls felt like something settling into place. When he stopped in front of her, she had to tilt her head back to see his face, and his shadow swallowed her down to the soles of her shoes. "Miss Penhallow." His voice was low and rough, as if it had been used for shouting in some kind of weather a long time ago, and had never quite recovered. "Yes, Rhett Brockway." He did not put out his hand. He nodded back over his shoulder. "My brothers, Asher, Ridge, the middle one." Asher tipped his head and said "ma'am" in a soft baritone. The youngest, Ridge, said nothing at all. He just looked at her with eyes that were trying to decide something. Adelaide felt her knees go to water. She had agreed to marry one man. The letter had been signed by one man. Nobody anywhere had said anything about 3. And these were not 3 ordinary men. These were 3 men of whom an entire town was visibly afraid. The letter said one person, she said, and was ashamed of how thin her voice came out. That is correct, Rhett said. There were no other promises in the letter. We need to talk before you decide. Come to the church. The Reverend is waiting. He led her down the dusty street, and her two-heeled traveling boots made small, useless prints between his enormous boot prints. Asher and Ridge followed at a careful distance, flanking like wolves escorting a thing they had agreed to keep alive. Adelaide felt every window of every building watching her go. The Reverend Obadiah Finch was a thin old man with kind eyes and a tremor in his hands. He stood at the front of his small church with a Bible already open on the lectern and a look on his face that suggested he had been praying without much hope. Rhett closed the church doors behind them. Then he turned to Adelaide and he told her the truth. He told it the way a man tells a thing when he has decided that softening it would be its own form of cruelty. There was a man named Bartholomew Driscoll, he said, who ran cattle and other things in the country south of town. Driscoll had served as a captain in a Confederate regiment during the war and had carried his bitterness back from Appomattox the way other men carried tobacco pouches. In the 11 years since the surrender, Driscoll had bought up land and lawmen and silence, and over those years at least 6 women had gone into his big house and come out as something less than they had been, and 2 had not come out at all. When Sheriff Eldon Tate had heard about the letter Ezra Penhallow had written to his daughter in Philadelphia, the sheriff had ridden up the Iron Bark Trail and laid the matter in front of the 3 Brockway brothers, because he knew there was nothing the law could do once Driscoll had set his mind to a thing, and he knew the Brockways were the only men in the county Driscoll could not buy or bury. We took every dollar we had saved from 6 years of trapping and skinning on this mountain, Rhett said. $5,000. We rode down to Driscoll, and we bought your father's debt off him in cash. He sold because cash in the hand is faster than waiting for a sheriff that might not come. But Driscoll will not stop. A man like that does not stop. Why, Adelaide said, and her voice was a thread, why pay that price for a girl you have never seen? Asher spoke from behind her. He had laid his book down on a pew, and he laid his hand flat over it as he spoke. Because we know what happens when nobody steps in, he said. And we will not let it happen again. Ridge punched the wood paneling of the wall hard enough to crack the boards. Then he turned his face away. Rhett held her eyes. The only legal way to keep Driscoll off you, he said, is marriage. A married woman cannot be claimed as property against a debt. Colorado territorial law is plain on that. So that is what I am offering. Marry me today in this church in front of this reverend, by witness of my brothers. You will have your own room in our cabin on Ironbark, your own door, your own bolt on the inside of that door. None of us will touch you without your asking. That is a promise from all 3 of us. Or he said, I will pay your fare back to Philadelphia, and you may sleep tonight in the rooming house and be on the eastbound stage in the morning. I will not stop you, but Driscoll will find another road to you. I cannot protect you from Colorado all the way to the Schuylkill River. Adelaide stood very still in the middle of the small church. She looked at the scar on his face. She looked at the white shirt he had ironed himself, the creases of it clumsy and uneven, the way a man's ironing always is. She looked at the way he stood half a step back from her, even now as if he understood that his sheer size was already a kind of pressure on a small woman in a strange town, and was doing his best to lessen it. She thought of her mother braiding her hair. Knowledge is the only firearm a woman is permitted to carry. Carry it loaded. She put her hand into the hidden pocket of her traveling dress. Her fingers found the little bronze medal on its faded ribbon. She drew it out and laid it on her open palm and held it up so that all three brothers could see. She did not say anything. She did not have to. Rhett Brockway looked at the medal. Then he looked at her face as if seeing her for the first time. The line of his jaw went tight under his beard. Cedar Creek, he said. October of '64. Yes. The brass medal in her hand caught the light coming through the colored glass of the small church window, and for a moment the room went very still. That medal belonged to my scout, Rhett said. His voice had changed. Some piece of armor that had been keeping his throat closed for many years had cracked, and a younger man's voice was coming out through the crack. Sergeant in the 6th, that was me. 20 years old and a shaved-tail sergeant, because every man older than me had been killed or sent home with a piece missing. They gave me a scout out of Pennsylvania to ride with me through the valley. He was older than my father. He had eyes like yours. Ezra Penhallow, Adelaide said. Ezra Penhallow, Rhett said. He pulled me out from under a dead horse on the morning of October the 19th. The horse went down on my leg, and I could not move it, and the rebels were dismounting at the edge of the field, and I had a fancy notion of dying right there, with the bridle in my teeth. Your daddy came back across 200 yards of open ground, with rebel skirmishers pouring fire into the grass behind him, and he took an axe to the saddle, and he got me free, and he carried me half a mile to the rear with his shoulder under my arm, and never said one word about it after. General Sheridan pinned that medal on him 3 weeks later, in front of the whole brigade, and the only thing your daddy said when the general handed it to him was, "Thank you, sir, my boy. Back yonder is all right." Rhett Brockway, who frightened an entire town, when he walked into it, lowered his eyes for a moment as if he could not look directly at the medal in her palm. "I owe him my life," he said. 12 years I have owed him my life. I did not know he had a daughter until Sheriff Tate came up the mountain 3 weeks ago and said that name. Ezra Penhallow, from Philadelphia. In debt to a man who hates Yankees and breaks women. He raised his eyes again. The brass color of them was wet at the edges now, but his voice did not move. "I would have married you anyway," he said, "for another reason that I will tell you when there is time. But the medal in your hand, Miss Penhallow, makes this a thing I cannot walk away from." Adelaide closed her fingers around the medal. "I will marry you," she said, "today. But I have conditions. Name them." "I am not property," she said. "I am not merchandise. If I walk into this marriage, I walk in as a partner, not a possession. You will tell me the truth in this house, even when the truth is hard. You will not decide things for me without speaking them aloud. And the bolt on the inside of that bedroom door belongs to me alone." The corner of Rhett's mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile. It was the closest thing to a smile she would see on him for many days afterward. "Fair deal," he said. Behind him, Ridge muttered to Asher in a voice that was supposed to be quiet but was not. "She decides for herself," Ridge said. "I like her." Asher closed his eyes briefly, and Adelaide saw something cross his face that looked almost like relief, as if a man who had been holding a long breath for many years had been allowed to let some of it out. The wedding took place 2 hours later in that same small church, Adelaide wore the navy blue traveling dress, dust and all. She had no flowers and no music and no bridesmaid. Half the town crowded into the doorway and the windows not to celebrate but to watch. Ezra Penhallow was there. He stood in the back row in a coat that was too big for him now, and his hands shook so badly that he had to keep them folded in front of him to hide it, and he could not look his daughter in the face. Reverend Finch read the service in a voice that kept losing its place. When he came to the part about the kiss, Adelaide closed her eyes by reflex, and every muscle in her went stiff as river ice. She felt Rhett step closer. She felt the heat of him, and the shadow of him falling across her like a mountain putting out the sun. Then she felt the gentlest thing she had felt in a year. His lips brushed her forehead. Not her mouth, her forehead. Light as a prayer. Easy, he murmured so quietly that nobody else in the church could possibly have heard. Easy. I have got you. The town, watching the doorway, let out a breath all at once. They had come to see a beast tear into a girl from Philadelphia. They had seen something else. They did not know what to do with it. After the service in the gathering dusk, Ezra Penhallow caught his daughter by the sleeve in the churchyard. His eyes were the eyes of an old soldier who had not slept in many years. "Addie," he whispered. "I never meant—" "Not now, Pa," she said. "There will be a time. This is not it." She placed in his hand her mother's silver wedding ring. He looked down at it and his mouth moved without making a sound. Then she walked away from him toward the 4 horses that the brothers had already saddled at the rail. Rhett lifted her into the saddle of a small chestnut mare with a kind eye, and his hands were on her waist for one heartbeat, and then gone. "This is Bramble," he said. "She is gentle. She will not throw you even if you do something foolish." They rode out of Pinewood Gulch in formation. Rhett at the front, Adelaide on Bramble behind him, Asher on her right hand, Ridge at the rear, his head turning every few seconds to scan the road behind them. The road became a trail. The trail began to climb. Ironbark Mountain rose ahead of them, the iron color of its high stones gone purple in the long shadows. After half an hour, Asher reined in and pointed to a place where the soft earth at the side of the trail was disturbed. 2 horses, he said. Town shod. Not local. Came up this trail this morning and turned off east through the pines. Nobody we know rides east through the pines. There is nothing east of here for 30 miles. Driscoll said Ridge. Maybe said Rhett. Maybe not. We go careful. That night they camped beside a creek that sang over smooth stones. Asher made coffee strong enough to strip bark. Ridge laid out jerky and hard biscuits and a piece of yellow cheese. Rhett set up a small canvas tent for Adelaide and put her bedroll inside it. "The 3 of you," she said. "Where do you sleep?" "Outside," said Ridge. "We have slept outside for 6 years before we built the cabin. One more night will not kill anyone. It is going to be cold enough to see your breath." "Then we will see our breath," said Ridge, and grinned at her for the first time, a quick fox grin that vanished as soon as it had come. She lay down inside the tent and pulled the blankets up to her chin, and she listened to the creek and the wind, and somewhere far off the long, lonely call of a wolf, and she peeked out through the flap of the tent. Rhett sat by the dying fire with the long Sharp's rifle across his knees, and his eyes scanning the darkness. Asher lay on his side, eyes open. His book closed against his chest. Ridge leaned against the trunk of a pine with a knife in his hand, alert as a hawk on a fence post. None of them slept. All three of them stood watch over her through the entire night. She closed her eyes against the canvas wall of the tent and felt something crack inside her chest that she had not known was sealed. It was not trust yet. Trust would take longer than that. But it was the first hairline fracture in the wall of fear she had carried up from Philadelphia. And through that fracture, just for a moment, she could feel air. In the morning, the trail steepened, and after 2 more hours of climbing, they came up over a saddle of red rock, and there it was. The Brockway homestead. Brockway. It was not a small cabin. It was a proper 2-story structure of pine logs, chinked tight against the wind, with a stone chimney rising tall, and a covered porch wrapping 3 sides. Behind it stood a stable, a chicken coop, a tanning shed, a small smokehouse. A clearing of half an acre had been won out of the trees by axe and sweat, and a clear creek ran along the northern edge of the clearing. The whole place had been built by men who understood that a poorly built house meant death when winter came down off the peaks. "Rhett designed it," Ridge said, and there was an unmistakable pride in his voice. "Asher built it. I dug the foundation. Inside, a massive stone fireplace took up the western wall. A handmade oak table sat in the center with 6 chairs around it. 2 long shelves held provisions on one side and books on the other. 2 whole shelves of books, their spines cracked from use. He led her up the stair to the second floor. 3 bedrooms opened off a short hallway. He stopped in front of the first door. "This one is yours," he said. The room was small but clean. A pine bedstead, a cedar mattress, 2 wool blankets folded square at the foot, a window that looked east toward the rising sun, a pitcher and basin on a small table, a chair, a nail in the wall on which to hang a dress. He pointed to the door. "There is a bolt on the inside," he said. "Use it. You want me to lock the door against you?" "I want you to feel safe," he said. When he had gone back downstairs, she closed the door. She slid the iron bolt home. She stood with her hand still on the cold metal of it for a long moment, and she found that she was not locking the door because she was afraid of him. She was locking it because for the first time in her 20 years of life, she had a door that nobody on the other side of it could open without her permission. That small fact felt heavier than gold. Later that afternoon, while she was unpacking the few things she had brought from Philadelphia, there came the sound of a horse coming hard up the trail. She heard Rhett step out onto the porch. She heard him say easy in the same low voice he had used in the church, but this time he was not speaking to her. "Sheriff Tate," she heard him say. "What?" She came out onto the upstairs landing where she could hear without being seen. Sheriff Eldon Tate was a barrel-chested man with a gray mustache and a Union Army cavalry coat that had been turned into a working coat by 10 years of patching. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hand, and his face was the color of milk that had sat too long in summer heat. "I am sorry to ride up here on your wedding day," the sheriff said. "There is a thing you need to know, Brockway. A thing that maybe changes how you keep watch tonight. Out with it." 2 men were drinking in the back of the saloon last evening, the sheriff said. They were not local men. Tucker pegged them straight away. They paid for their whiskey out of a leather pouch, and they paid in coin. They paid in Confederate gold pieces. There was a silence in the yard. Adelaide could hear through the open window Asher draw in a long breath and let it out again. Confederate gold, the sheriff said. 11 years after Appomattox. Coin that should not be in circulation anywhere in this territory. There is exactly one band of men in the whole western country still passing that coin Brockway. The Falk gang, Ransom Falk and 6 others. They knocked over the Union Pacific Paymaster's car at Cheyenne Crossing in '73 and got away with a strongbox of Confederate gold the rebels had been hiding for the post-war. The federal marshals took them at Fort Hays in '74. The whole gang was supposed to be inside Leavenworth right now, hard at it with a sledgehammer. Rhett did not move. Ridge had come up beside him and was very still. "You are telling me," Rhett said slowly, "that men spending Falk gold are drinking in my town?" "I am telling you that the sheriff said. And I am telling you that I sent a wire to the United States Marshal's office in Denver 3 weeks ago about another matter, and I have not heard back. I sent another wire last week. I have not heard back. Either every wire out of this county is being lost Brockway, or somebody at the other end is sitting on them." The sheriff put his hat back on his head. "Watch your trail," he said. "Watch your wife." He turned his horse and rode away down the trail toward town, and the dust of his going hung in the late afternoon light for a long time. Inside the cabin, Adelaide stood at the upstairs window with her hand pressed flat against the glass. She did not yet know the names. Ransom Falk and Bartholomew Driscoll were still only sounds to her dark words that had passed through a porch and up through a window. She did not yet know that her father carried in his coat pocket a small leather memorandum book in which he had been writing down, in the careful copperplate of a man who had once scouted for General Sheridan, every Confederate gold piece that had crossed Driscoll's hand for the past 6 months, and every name attached to each transaction. She did not know that her own arrival in Pinewood Gulch had not been a private misfortune at all, but the last thread that joined 2 very different ropes into a single noose. She knew only that the door behind her had a bolt on the inside, and that somewhere downstairs 3 large, quiet men were already speaking in low voices about how to keep her alive, and that out beyond the clearing the Ironbark Range was going dark, in the way mountains go dark slowly, one ridge at a time, like a great animal lying down for the night. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass of the window. Knowledge, her mother had said, is the only firearm a woman is permitted to carry. Carry it loaded. She turned from the window and went downstairs to listen. The first week on Ironbark was the longest week of Adelaide Penhallow's life, and also looking back from later years. It was one of the shortest because she could not afterward remember the order of the days, only the order of the lessons. Rhett woke before the sun. She would hear his bootfalls go down the stair and across the main room and out the door, and then she would hear the long rifle leaving its pegs by the lintel, and then nothing. He would be gone 3 hours sometimes, 4, walking his trap line through the pines and down into the saddles where the pine martens denned and the fox came at dawn. He came back smelling of sap and cold air, and sometimes of blood, and he hung the day's catch in the smokehouse before he came inside to take his coffee. Asher took the morning duty around the cabin. He cut wood. He drew water. He kept his leather book on the table where he could write in it as the day went on. Ridge took the perimeter. He left at a different hour each morning by a different trail, because he said routine was the thing that got men killed in country like this. And a man who left his cabin every morning at 6 o'clock by the same path was a man who had already been measured for his coffin. On the third morning, Rhett came in from his trapline with 2 plants in his hand. He laid them side by side on the oak table. "Look at them," he said. She looked. They were nearly identical. Both had little white flowers in flat clusters. Both had hollow stems. Both had finely cut leaves the color of new spring. "This one is wild parsley," he said, touching the left plant. "Safe, sweet, goes well in stew." He touched the right plant. "This one is water hemlock. It looks the same. It tastes sweeter than the parsley. A piece the size of your fingernail will start your hands shaking inside 15 minutes. A piece the size of your thumbnail will kill you inside an hour. There is no remedy. There is no antidote." Then he turned the right plant over and showed her the lower stem. "Purple spots," he said. "The hemlock has purple spots on the stem. The parsley does not. That is the whole difference between supper and a grave." She looked at the 2 plants for a long time. "Show me the other one," she said. By the end of that day, he had laid 11 plants on the table for her, and she could call the name of every one of them and tell him which ones a woman could eat, which ones would heal a wound, which ones would close a throat, and which ones would simply kill outright. He never once told her that she did not need to learn all of them. He simply taught her the way a man teaches the things he believes will keep a person alive, and let her decide for herself how much of it she wanted to carry. Asher taught her the sky. He took her out onto the porch on the 4th evening when a wall of cloud was moving in from the west, and he pointed up at the bottom of it. "Low gray cloud out of the west," he said. "Moving fast. Rain inside 6 hours. Anvil tops off to the north. Lightning before midnight. See that ring around the moon when she comes up? That is ice high in the air. Snow inside a day if the wind holds." He taught her dirt as well as sky. He took her out behind the smokehouse and squatted down on his heels and pointed to a print pressed into the soft black earth. "Mountain lion," he said. "See the shape? No claws showing. Cats walk with their claws drawn back. A dog or a wolf will leave 4 claw marks in front of the toes. A cat will not. This print is fresh from this morning. She came down to the creek and went back up into the spruce. We will see her again. We will not see her unless she wants to be seen." He told her about the people who had walked these mountains long before the Brockways. The Ute had hunted on these slopes for many human lifetimes. Their old trails crossed and recrossed the ridges, and Asher had walked many of those trails and marked them in his leather book. Because he said a man who lived on a mountain and did not learn what the people who came before him had learned was a man who would not live there long. Ridge taught her to shoot. He started her on a tin can at 50 yards with a single shot rifle she could barely hold steady. He stood behind her and corrected her stance with 2 fingers at her elbow. He showed her how to breathe in and slowly out and squeeze at the bottom of the breath and not flinch. She missed for an hour. Then she hit the can. Then she hit it again. By the end of the 5th day, she was hitting the can 4 times out of 5, and Ridge, who was a hard teacher, gave her a single nod that was the equivalent of a long speech from a softer man. On the 6th day, he set up a wooden plank cut roughly in the shape of a man at 70 yards. "The can does not shoot back," he said. "The next thing that comes for you on this mountain is gonna shoot back. You need to be able to put a piece of lead where it matters before he puts a piece of lead where you live." She took 6 shots. The first 3 she missed clean. The 4th grazed the plank. The 5th and the 6th went through the chest of the wooden man at 70 yards. Ridge looked at the plank, and then he looked at her. "Good," he said. "Get used to that." She brought back in return the only skill from her old life that meant anything up here. She cooked. She found wild ramps growing along the creek and dug them up with her bare hands. She combined them with canned tomatoes and a strip of dried beef and a pinch of black pepper from a tin on the shelf. And when the stew had simmered for 2 hours over the fire, it filled the cabin with a smell that brought all 3 brothers in from whatever they were doing, the way hounds come in when somebody opens a smoked ham. They ate that stew in silence the first night. Rhett went back for a second bowl without being asked. Then a third. Asher closed his eyes while chewing, and a look passed across his face that Adelaide could not name the look of a man remembering something he had thought lost. Ridge ate with his head down. When he set his empty bowl on the oak table, he set it down with a careful gentleness that surprised her, as though the empty bowl were something precious. By the end of the second week, she had reorganized the kitchen shelves, planted a row of herbs in a strip of turned earth beside the porch, and worked out a rotation of meals that stretched their stored provisions an extra month. She was not just cooking. She was building something underneath the cooking the way a foundation is built underneath a house. On the night of her 12th day on the mountain, Asher took down a bone flute he had carved years before and had not played in a long time. He sat by the fire and he turned it over in his hands, and then he set it to his lips and he played a tune. It was a slow tune. She knew it the moment she heard it. It was the song the 6th Cavalry had marched to in the Shenandoah. The song that every Union veteran in the country could whistle without thinking. "The girl I left behind me." She began to sing the words very softly, almost under her breath. She did not know she was going to sing them until she was singing them. Rhett, who had been mending a bridle at the table, set the bridle down. He did not look at her. He just sat very still while the bone flute and her voice moved together in the small lit space of the cabin. When the tune ended, none of them spoke for a while. Then Asher set the flute down on the mantel. He cleared his throat once. "It has been a long time since this house had a woman's voice in it," he said. He went up the stairs to bed without saying anything else. And Adelaide sat by the fire across from Rhett, and she understood that something had moved between the 4 of them in that small room that none of them quite had the language for. It was on the morning of the 16th day that she found the sketchbook. She was tidying the main room. She had taken the books down from the lower shelf one at a time. To dust behind them, and Asher's leather sketchbook had slipped out of her hands and fallen open on the rug. It fell open to a drawing of a young girl. She was 16, perhaps 17. Honey-colored hair, wide eyes, a laughing mouth caught in mid-sentence. She had the same high cheekbones as the 3 brothers and the same straight nose, but everything in her face was lighter, easier untouched. At the bottom of the page in Asher's careful hand was a small inscription. Junie Brockway, 1853 to 1870. She wrote us one line. "We came too late." Adelaide turned the page. Junie reading by a window. Junie braiding her hair. Junie laughing at something the artist had said. Page after page. And at the back of the book, a different kind of drawing, heavier, the charcoal pressed deep. A simple wooden cross on a hillside. Wild flowers growing up around the base of it. You should not be looking at that. Adelaide turned. Ridge stood in the doorway. His face had gone the color of paper. "That is our sister," he said. His voice cracked on the word. "What happened to her?" "Ask Rhett," he said. He turned and walked out of the cabin and across the yard and into the trees, and a few seconds later she heard the heavy thud of his fist hitting a tree trunk. That night, when Asher and Ridge had gone up to bed, Rhett sat by the fire with a whetstone and the long blade of a skinning knife. The slow scrape of stone on steel was the only sound in the room for a long time. "I saw the drawing," Adelaide said. "I saw Junie." His hands stopped. The blade hung still in his lap. Then he told her slowly the way a man pulls a thorn from a place that has never quite healed. Their father had been Joseph Brockway. He had gone east in '61 with the 1st Wisconsin Volunteers, and he had come home in '65 with a piece of grape shot still in his thigh and a thirst that no creek water would ever again satisfy. He had drunk steadily for 5 years after the war, and the drinking had eaten through him the way rust eats through a rifle barrel. In Bozeman in 1869, he had begun to lose money to a banker named Kingsley Mercer. Mercer had been a respected man in that town, married, 3 children, sat in the front pew at the Methodist church on Sunday and put a $5 gold piece in the collection plate where everyone could see him do it. By the spring of 1870, Joseph Brockway owed Mercer $4,000 he could not pay. Mercer made a quiet offer. He needed a girl to keep his house, he said. Joseph's daughter Junie was just turned 17. If Joseph would send the girl to keep his house for 2 years, the $4,000 would be considered settled, and the Brockway family would owe him nothing. He would pay her room and board out of his own kindness. He would treat her well. Joseph Brockway sent his daughter. Rhett was in Wyoming that spring. He had been hiring on as a guard for the Wells Fargo coaches running between Cheyenne and Laramie, and his money went home every month to keep the family going. Asher was in St. Louis studying at a hospital where men learned to sew up wounds and set bones because Asher had always wanted to be a doctor and had been close in those days to becoming one. Ridge was 19 and was the only Brockway in the house when Joseph made his deal. He had begged his father not to do it. He had stood in the parlor of Mercer's big white house the next day and demanded that his sister be returned. Mercer's 2 paid men had thrown him off the porch and broken his arm. For 3 months, Rhett said my sister wrote to all 3 of us in letters that we read later. And she said in those letters that everything was fine. She said the work was hard, but that Mercer was a Christian man, and that she was learning to bake bread and to manage a household, and that we were not to worry. She said in every letter that we were not to worry. The blade lay still in his lap. The fire popped behind him. In April of '70, Asher said she sent me a letter that was not like the other letters. It was 3 sentences. She said, "Asher, I cannot anymore. Come and get me. Please." Adelaide had not heard Asher come back down the stairs. He was standing in the doorway of the main room, his face in shadow, his hands hanging at his sides. "I rode 800 miles," he said. "I changed horses 4 times. I rode through a thunderstorm in the Black Hills. And I rode through 2 days and a night without sleep. I came up the porch of Mercer's White House at dusk on the 4th day, and his housekeeper opened the door and said, 'Oh, sir, I am sorry. I am so sorry. The young lady passed 3 days ago.'" Asher closed his eyes for a long moment. "She had hanged herself," he said, "with a bedsheet from the crossbeam of the room he kept her in. She left a note that was 2 lines long, and they would not let me read it. The sheriff was Mercer's friend. He told me the family wished the matter to be private." The fire popped again. "I rode home," Asher said, "and I waited for Rhett." Rhett looked up. His eyes in the firelight were the color of brass that had been heated past anger and into something harder than anger. "I came home from Wyoming," he said. Asher was waiting on the porch. Ridge was in the barn with his fists wrapped because he could not stop hitting things. Our father was dead drunk in the kitchen and had been for 3 days. I read Junie's letters one at a time. Then I read the second to last letter and the last letter, and then I rode for Bozeman. I went into Mercer's parlor in the middle of the afternoon," he said. He was sitting in a leather chair, drinking coffee from a china cup. "I took the brass medal that General Sheridan had pinned on me at Cedar Creek out of my coat pocket, and I laid it on the side table next to his coffee so that he would know which kind of man had come for him. Then I shot him through the heart." Adelaide did not move. "The sheriff of Bozeman was Mercer's drinking partner," Rhett said. "He raised the cry inside the hour. Asher had 2 horses saddled outside of town. We rode south. Ridge rode behind us with a pine bough sweeping out our tracks. We crossed into Wyoming territory before sundown the next day, and we kept riding until we did not have a town behind us anymore, and then we came up onto Ironbark and we stopped here." 6 years, Adelaide said. 6 years, Rhett said. "There is a federal warrant in Montana with my name on it. There is a federal warrant with Asher's name on it as accessory and with Ridge's name on it as accessory. We have not been off this mountain for more than a day at a time in 6 years." He set the whetstone down. "When Sheriff Tate came up here 3 weeks ago and said your name, Rhett said Ezra Penhallow's name and said what Driscoll meant to do with you. I sat by this fire for a long time after he rode away. I owed your daddy my life. That alone was enough. But there was another thing." He looked into the fire. "I'd been telling myself for 6 years that there had not been a single moment when I could have stepped in for Junie, that she had been beyond saving by the time any of us knew. Some nights I almost believed it. Most nights I did not. When Tate told us about you, I thought somebody has to step in for this one. Somebody has to do for her what nobody did for our girl. And maybe if I do that, the part of me that has been awake every night for 6 years can finally sleep." Adelaide stood up from her chair. She crossed the room and stood in front of him, and she laid her hand over the back of his hand on the whetstone. "I understand now," she said. "I understand why." He did not pull his hand away. He did not lift it. He simply sat there, with her hand on his, and after a long time he turned his hand over and let her fingers rest in his palm, and his eyes never left the fire. That night she did not bolt her bedroom door. It was 3 days after that, in the middle of a long blue morning, that Sheriff Tate came up the mountain again, and this time he did not come alone. He came with Ezra Penhallow. Adelaide was hanging wet wash on the line behind the cabin when she heard the horses. She turned and she saw her father climbing painfully down out of the saddle in the yard, and for a moment she nearly lost her breath. He was thinner than she had ever seen him. His coat hung off his shoulders. His beard was streaked with white. He looked like a man who had walked a long way in his own punishment and had not yet been allowed to set the burden down. He did not come toward her at first. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hand. Then he walked forward slowly and he stopped 6 feet short of her because he understood that he had not earned the closer ground. "Addie," he said, "I have come up here to say a thing in front of your husband and his brothers. And then I have come up here to say a thing to you." She did not speak. She just looked at him. Rhett came out onto the porch with the long rifle in the crook of his arm. He did not raise it. He simply held it in a way that said it could be raised if it needed to be. Asher stepped out behind him. Ridge came around the side of the cabin from the woodpile. Sergeant Brockway Ezra said, looking up at Rhett, "I did not know it was you on this mountain until the sheriff told me yesterday afternoon. If I had known." He stopped. He swallowed. "If I had known, I would have come up sooner." "You are here now," Rhett said. "Speak." Ezra Penhallow turned his hat slowly in his hands, the way a man turns a wheel that he is not sure he wants to turn. "Bartholomew Driscoll is not what he appears to be," Ezra said. "I have spent 6 months in his town, and I have lost a great deal of money at his card table. And a man who loses money slowly to another man learns things that nobody else learns. Driscoll has been paying his debts in the territory in Confederate gold. Old gold. Gold that should not still be in circulation. I have watched him pay it across to the freight company. I have watched him pay it across to the cattle buyer out of Denver. I have watched him pay it to 2 of his hired hands as a bonus." He reached into his coat and brought out a leather memorandum book. "I have written it all down," he said. "I have written down every coin I have seen change hands. I have written down every man who took one. I have written down dates and amounts and the names. I have written down something else as well." He drew a long breath. "3 months ago," Ezra said, "I followed Driscoll into the cottonwoods south of his ranch one night because I had had too much whiskey, and I had gotten brave the way a coward gets brave when whiskey is in him. He met a man under those cottonwoods. The other man was riding a roan with a Texas brand. They talked for a quarter of an hour. I lay in the brush 20 yards off, and I heard most of it. The other man's name is Ransom Falk." Asher's hand closed slowly around the porch post. "The Falk gang is not in Leavenworth," Ezra said. "They came out of Leavenworth 4 months ago. The federal government has not announced it. Driscoll is hiding them. He has been hiding them on a piece of his ranch up against the foothills, and feeding them and supplying them, and in return they pay him in the gold from their old robberies. He told Falk that night that he had a way to bring in something larger than gold. He said that an old enemy of his, a Yankee, was about to deliver something even more valuable into his hands. He used that word, Yankee. He spat it. He did not say my name," Ezra said, "but he said the Yankee. And the next morning I sat in the saloon and I knew that the Yankee was me, and that whatever I had that he wanted had something to do with my daughter." Adelaide felt the cold of the morning go up her spine. "I wrote the letter to you that very night," Ezra said. I wrote the part where I told you not to come. I wrote the part where I told you he would kill me if you did not. I sat in my room with that letter in front of me for 2 hours, and I watched my hand shake, and I could not decide which sentence was the truth. So I sent both of them. I sent the letter, and I prayed. He looked up at his daughter for the first time. I knew when I sent it that I was a coward, he said. I am a coward, Addie. I have been a coward since your mother died, and I will be one until I die. I came up here today because I would rather be a living coward, standing in front of my daughter, than a dead one in a saloon. I came up here because there's a man in town who has been watching my room for 2 days, and last night he was joined by a second man, and they paid for their whiskey in Confederate gold, and I did not stay in that room a third night. He held out the leather memorandum book. This is everything I have, he said. Take it. Use it however you need to use it. Whatever happens to me from here, this book is the only piece of me that is worth anything. And it is yours. Rhett came down off the porch and took the memorandum book. He turned through the pages quickly. His face did not change. When he reached the last written page, he closed the book and tucked it inside his coat. You will sleep here tonight, he said to Ezra. You will sleep here every night until this is finished. There is a cot in the loft above the smokehouse. We will keep watch in turn. Ezra nodded. He could not speak. Adelaide crossed the 6 feet of yard that her father had not been willing to cross, and she put her arms around him, and she felt his thin shoulders shake under her hands. I forgive you, Pa, she said. It does not stop the hurt, but I forgive you. He cried then. He did not make a sound, but she felt his face wet against her hair, and she held him until he had finished. And when he stepped back from her, he stood a little straighter than he had stood when he climbed down from the horse. It was 4 days after that, in the gray hour before dawn, that Ridge brought in a prisoner alive. Adelaide woke to the sound of boots on the porch, and a man's voice cursing low and steady in a way that suggested he had been cursing for some time. She came down the stairs in her wrapper with her hair in a long plait over one shoulder, and she stopped on the bottom step. Ridge stood in the main room with a wiry man pushed face down across the oak table. The wiry man's wrists were lashed behind him with rawhide. There was a cut over his left eye that was bleeding into his beard. He had a face like a hatchet, and a long, thin scar on his throat the shape of a rope mark. Picked him up on the western trail an hour before sunup, Ridge said without looking at her. He was carrying field glasses and counting our windows. I let him count for a while before I came up behind him. Rhett came down the stair. Asher came in from the porch with a coil of fresh rope. Ezra stood in the kitchen doorway and said nothing. The wiry man spat blood on the oak table. You boys are dead already, he said conversationally. You just have not laid down yet. What is your name? Rhett said. Jeb Quill. Who sent you up? Quill grinned. There was a tooth missing in the front of the grin, and the grin made a slow, ugly thing of his face. Ransom Falk sent me up, he said. There are 5 more of us coming behind. We will be at this cabin inside 5 days. Driscoll has cut us a deal. We do the work on you and on the woman and on the old Yankee in your smokehouse, and Driscoll gives us a played-out silver mine in the Sangres for the winter, and a clean horse string when the snow breaks. Then we ride south, and you are nothing but a story. Asher pulled up a chair and sat down across from the man's pinned face. "You wear a rope scar on your throat," Asher said. "The Yankee Army did not hang men in their own prison camps. Where did you come by a rope scar?" Quill stopped grinning. "Andersonville," he said after a moment. "64. A guard tried to string me up over a piece of cornbread. The sergeant of the guard cut me down because he wanted the cornbread for himself." Asher nodded once. "I served at Elmira," he said. 19 years old, a hospital steward. We had Confederate prisoners in Elmira, dying of the same thing your boys were dying of in Andersonville. I carried quinine to them when the surgeon would let me, and sometimes when he would not. There were 2 boys from a Tennessee regiment I sat up with all night the week before they died, and I wrote letters home for them, and I posted those letters with my own coin. I am telling you this so that you understand what kind of house you are lying on the table of. You are not in the hands of a man who hates you for the coat you wore. You are in the hands of a man who would have brought you water in 64 if the war had put us on the same hill." Quill did not answer, but something in his shoulders went a little less hard. "Tell me about the marshal," Rhett said. The wiry man looked up sharply, even with his face pressed sideways to the table. He stared at Rhett for a long moment. "What marshal?" "The federal marshal in Denver," Rhett said. "The one Sheriff Tate has been wiring to for 3 weeks. The one who has not answered." Quill laughed. It was a short, ugly laugh. "Hardesty," he said. "United States Marshal Jericho Hardesty. He is the one who told Driscoll that nobody federal was coming up here for any reason. Driscoll has been paying him for 2 years. In the same gold friend. Hardesty is the reason no answer ever came back to your sheriff. Hardesty is the reason you and the woman and the old Yankee are alone on this mountain." Adelaide felt the floorboards under her bare feet go very cold. Asher wrote it all down in the leather book. The names, the numbers, the places. When he was done writing, he closed the book and tucked it into his coat next to Ezra Penhallow's smaller book, and the 2 records sat together against his ribs like 2 halves of a single thing. Rhett pulled Quill upright by the collar and set him in a chair and put the bronze medal from Cedar Creek on the table in front of him. "I do not kill prisoners," he said. "That is the way I was raised. When this is over, I am giving you to Sheriff Tate. You will live. Whether Driscoll lets you live after that is between you and Driscoll. Right now, you are going to eat the breakfast my wife is going to put in front of you, and you are going to drink the coffee, and you are going to sit quiet in that chair while we plan how to keep you alive long enough to testify." Quill looked at the medal on the table for a long time. Then he looked at the woman in the wrapper at the bottom of the stair. "Lord help you, miss," he said quietly. "You have married into the only house in this country that is going to fight for you." She did not answer him. She walked into the kitchen and she put on the coffee. The 5 days that followed were the longest stretch of work Adelaide Penhallow had ever done in a row. They worked from before dawn until full dark. Rhett laid out the cabin's defenses on the oak table with twigs and pebbles and pieces of bread. Asher set 23 tripwires through the western timber, each strung with a small tin bell that would ring before it broke. Ridge taught Adelaide to load the long sharps in 8 seconds and to fire it from a kneeling position, and then from prone and then from a window with the sill at her elbows. Ezra worked too. He could no longer scout the way he had scouted in 64, but he could read country. and he sat on the porch with Asher's leather book open on his knee, and he drew a careful map of every piece of the western approach to the cabin, every fold of ground, every place where a man could lie hidden from a window and from a porch, but not from both at once. When he laid it on the table, Rhett looked at it for a long time, and then he looked at Ezra. "You have not lost it," Sergeant Rhett said softly. "It is the only thing I did not drink away," Ezra said. On the evening of the fourth day, when Asher and Ridge had gone up to bed, and Ezra was asleep on the cot in the loft above the smokehouse, Rhett sat by the fire polishing the long sharps. Adelaide came down the stairs in her nightdress with a wool shawl around her shoulders, and she sat in the chair across from him. "When you killed Mercer," she said, "were you afraid?" He looked up. "I was afraid before I went into the house," he said. "I was not afraid once I was inside it. The war taught me that. The fear comes first. The doing comes after. Once the doing has begun, there is no room left in a man for the fear." "Tomorrow they come," she said. "Tomorrow they come. You are not afraid." He set the sharps across his knees and looked into the fire. "I am afraid of one thing," he said. "I am afraid of you going before I do. I have not had anyone to lose since Junie. 6 years I have not been afraid of dying. Now I am afraid. That is the price of you." She rose from her chair and crossed to him. She bent down. She kissed him for the first time on the mouth. It was a brief kiss and a careful one, and she felt his hand come up and touch her cheek with the lightness of a man afraid to break a thing. Then she straightened and she went back up the stair without another word, and she lay in her bed with her hand pressed flat over her own mouth, and she did not sleep. Dawn of the fifth day came up gray. The mist lay thick along the western timber. The bells of Asher's tripwires began to ring just after first light. 3 of them at once, then 4, then 6, in a pattern that did not make sense, that came from too many directions. "They are pulling our heads," Asher called from the porch. "They are ringing bells. They do not need to ring. The real line of attack will be the one that does not ring a bell at all." "The Western Rock Gap," Rhett said. "The Ute Trail. Quill said it would be the Western Rock Gap. Get to your places." Asher took the loophole at the front shutter with the long rifle. Ridge climbed into the loft of the stable, the high ground, with both pistols. Rhett walked out into the open clearing in front of the cabin, with the long sharps held loose at his side, the bait. Ezra Penhallow, with his old service revolver in his hand, and a face that was 20 years younger than it had been a week before, took the rear window where he could watch the creek. Adelaide was in the cellar under the floor with the heavy Colt revolver Rhett had given her. The iron hatch bolted from beneath the smell of dirt and old potatoes in her nose, her heart beating so loud she could hear it under her own ribs. She heard the first shot. It was the long, flat report of the sharps. It was Asher's. It meant Asher had seen a man. She heard the answering shot. It came from the western tree line, and it came from a heavier gun than a man on horseback should have been carrying. She heard Ridge open up from the stable loft, with both pistols, the way the gunfighters of the border country fired, alternating left and right in a steady rolling thunder. She heard her husband's voice in the yard, loud and even. "Falk. Last chance to lay it down." She heard the answer. It was not words. It was the bark of a sharps from across the clearing, and the answering bark of her husband's sharps from the yard, and then a silence, and then a heavy thump, and then her husband's voice again, lower this time, and not quite steady. Somebody in the cabin. Get to her. Now. There were boots on the floorboards above her head. There were boots, and they were not the boots of any of the men she knew. Adelaide Penhallow Brockway, 20 years old, 3 months out of Philadelphia, lay in the dark of the root cellar with the heavy revolver in her hand, and she listened to the boots stop directly above her, and she listened to her own breathing, and she remembered her mother saying knowledge is the only firearm a woman is permitted to carry it loaded. She thumbed back the hammer of the Colt without making a sound. The boots above her took one more step. Then they took another. She raised the revolver toward the line of light at the edge of the trapdoor, and she waited. The boards above her head creaked once more, and then a third time, and then a man's voice spoke. It was not a voice she knew. "Where is the woman?" the voice said, out loud. To no one, because there was no one in the cabin to hear him but Adelaide herself, 6 feet below his boot soles, and she was not going to answer him. She heard him move across the kitchen. She heard the sound of a tin canister being knocked off a shelf and rolling on the floor. She heard him pull open the door of the pantry and curse softly. She did not breathe. The trap door to the root cellar was set into the floorboards under the long oak table. A loose woven rug lay over the trap door. The hinges had been oiled by Asher Brockway last week with bear fat, because Asher was a man who oiled hinges before he was asked to oil them. There was a second way out of the cellar. It was a tunnel that ran 15 yards under the yard and came out on the bank of the creek at the back of the cabin behind the smokehouse. Asher had dug it out the previous summer, working an hour each evening for 4 months, and Adelaide had walked it twice in the past 5 days. She did not move toward the tunnel yet. She listened. The man above her stopped moving. Then he said in a different voice, almost amused, "Cellar." She heard him walk back across the kitchen. She heard him stop directly above the rug. She heard the slow scrape of his boot pushing the rug to one side. That was when she went. She crawled because the tunnel was too low to crouch in, and she crawled fast. The heavy Colt revolver pressed against her chest with one hand to keep it from clinking against the dirt. She came out of the tunnel mouth into the willow scrub on the creek bank, and she lay flat for 2 heartbeats while she got her bearings, and then she came up on her belly to her elbows and looked. He was a thin man with a sandy mustache, and he was lifting the trap door. She watched him from the back of the smokehouse 50 feet away. She watched him kneel down with his back to her and lower himself onto the cellar ladder. She watched the crown of his head disappear below the floor line. She came up out of the willows. She moved across the open yard, the way Ridge had taught her to move low and quick, and on the outside edges of her boots, so that her steps did not slap the ground. She came onto the porch silent. She came in through the open front door silent. She crossed the kitchen silent. She stood at the open trapdoor with the Colt in both hands, and she looked down into the dark of the cellar. He was at the bottom of the ladder with his back to her. He had a pistol in one hand and a candle in the other, and he was looking at the empty quilt where she had been lying. And she could see the slow understanding spreading through his shoulders that he had been brought to the wrong place. He started to turn. Adelaide Penhallow Brockway thumbed the hammer all the way back, and she squeezed the trigger at the bottom of her breath, the way Ridge had told her, and she did not flinch. The Colt bucked in her hands. The man in the cellar made a small surprised sound. The candle went out. He fell sideways against the foot of the ladder and did not move. She stood at the lip of the open trapdoor, and she looked down into the dark with the smoke of the powder hanging in the air around her face. And her hands began to shake only afterward, only when it was over, only when she understood what she had just done. She had killed a man. His name she would learn later from the wanted poster Sheriff Tate carried up to the cabin. 3 days after that had been Dax Pickett. He had been wanted in 3 states for the murder of a stagecoach driver. In '73. He had been with Ransom Falk's gang for 9 years. She closed the trapdoor over him. She slid the iron bolt across it. She walked out of the cabin onto the porch. The shooting in the yard had stopped. Rhett Brockway sat with his back against the wagon wheel that leaned against the cabin's eastern wall. The leg of his trousers was dark to the knee. Asher was kneeling beside him, cutting away the cloth around the wound. Ridge stood 30 paces out into the clearing with both pistols still in his hands, looking out toward the western rock gap where Ransom Falk lay on his side in the grass, with one hand pressed to his thigh, and the other hand empty. Mungo Strawn went into the trees. Ridge called back over his shoulder. I winged him, but I did not put him down. He has a horse hidden up there somewhere. Rhett looked up at her on the porch. His eyes went past her to the open cabin door. You. I am all right, she said. Pickett is in the cellar. He will not be coming up. He looked at her face for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes briefly and let his head rest back against the wagon wheel. Good girl, he said. Good girl. Asher had her father's leather book open on his knee and was writing in it even now in the middle of everything, the names and the time and the directions, because Asher Brockway was a man who wrote everything down, and a court of law was going to need every detail of this morning before the year was out. Ezra Penhallow came around the side of the cabin from the rear window with his old service revolver still in his hand and the smoke of it still on him. His hand was steady. He saw Adelaide standing on the porch, and he said only one word. Daughter. I am all right, Pa. Sheriff Tate rode into the yard an hour later with 4 men from Pinewood Gulch behind him. They had heard the shooting from the foot of the trail where the sheriff had been sitting with 3 deputies and an old farmer named Yarrow, who could shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 100 yards, because Sheriff Tate had decided 2 days earlier that he was not going to wait on a Denver wire that was never going to come. They took Falk down off the mountain alive, slung over his own saddle, and they took the body of Tobias Greer and the body of Hollister Vane and the body of Dax Pickett, and they took the prisoner Jeb Quill out of the smokehouse loft where he had been kept tied through the fight. And the procession that went down the Iron Bark Trail that afternoon was the largest body of men that road had carried in 6 years. They left Asher behind to dig the bullet out of Rhett's hip on the kitchen table. He used the kit from his old hospital days at Elmira, and he used a steel probe and a pair of small tongs and a clean linen cloth boiled in the kettle, and he worked for an hour with sweat running into his eyes, while Adelaide held a lamp close, and Ezra held Rhett's shoulders down, and Rhett did not cry out once, only ground his teeth so hard she heard them. When Asher dropped the bullet into the tin pan beside the lamp, it made a small flat sound the way a coin sounds when it is tossed onto a table. He looked up at his older brother. It was not the bone, he said. You will walk on it again. You will limp for a while. A man can limp, Rhett said hoarsely. A man can limp for a long time. That was the end of the fighting on the mountain. It was not the end of the fight. 3 days later, Sheriff Tate came back up the trail at mid-morning. He came with a folded paper in his hand and a look on his face that Adelaide had not yet seen there. A lawyer named Phineas Crowder rode in from Denver yesterday, the sheriff said. He has a writ in his bag for the annulment of your marriage on grounds of duress and for the arrest of all 3 Brockway brothers on a federal warrant out of Montana Territory, dated June of '70. Crowder is going to file the writ tomorrow morning in front of Judge Prudence Halloran. The judge has set the hearing for the day after tomorrow at the Pinewood Gulch Courthouse. He looked at Rhett, who was sitting in the chair by the fire, with his bandaged leg propped on a cushion. There is one more thing, the sheriff said. There is a federal marshal in Pinewood Gulch tonight. He came in on the same coach as Crowder. His name is Jericho Hardesty. Asher stood up very slowly from the table. Hardesty himself, he said. In person, said the sheriff. He has been sitting in the back of the saloon since 6 o'clock yesterday evening. Rhett did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a particular knock at his door for many years and had finally heard it. He came up here in person, Rhett said, because Driscoll cannot afford for Falk to live to testify. Hardesty has come up to Pinewood Gulch to make sure Falk dies in his cell before that hearing, or to make sure that the testimony Falk gives gets thrown out. And he has come up to file a federal writ on us at the same time, so that the 3 of us are in chains on the way to Montana before any of this can get heard out loud. Yes, said Sheriff Tate. That is what I think also. Then we have to be in front of Judge Halloran with everything before he can move, said Asher. Every name, every coin, every body. We have to do something else first, said Adelaide. All 3 of them looked at her. We have to find every woman in Pinewood Gulch who has ever set foot inside Driscoll's house, she said. And we have to put them in front of Judge Halloran one after another. The coins and the gang and the marshal will get Driscoll arrested. The women will get him hanged. Rhett looked at her for a long moment. You understand what you are asking, he said. You are asking those women to stand up in a public room in a town full of men who knew and said nothing. You are asking them to say in their own voices what was done to them. I am not asking, she said. I am going to ask. They will decide for themselves. She rode down the mountain with Asher that afternoon. She went on a small chestnut mare named Bramble. She wore the navy blue traveling dress she had come out west and brushed clean and pressed. She wore her mother's silver wedding ring on her left hand and her father's bronze medal in the hidden pocket of her dress. And she went to find the women of Pinewood Gulch one door at a time. The first door she knocked on was the door of Maple Hennessy, who had been a girl named Maple Cottrell in Philadelphia 10 years before, and who had been Adelaide's closest friend in childhood, until Maple's family had come west on the Union Pacific to start over. They had not seen each other since they were 10. Maple was 20 now, married to a quiet ranch hand, and when she opened the door of her small white house and saw the woman on her step, she put both hands to her mouth. I worked in his house for 14 days when I was 16, Maple said after she had cried and after she had let Adelaide and Asher sit at her kitchen table and after her husband had come in from the corral and stood behind her chair with his hand on her shoulder. 14 days. My mother died of milk fever the next spring, and I have always thought she died because of what she could not unhear when I came home from that house. Will you say it in front of the judge? Adelaide said. Maple looked up at her husband. He did not speak. He squeezed her shoulder. I will say it in front of the judge, Maple said. The second door belonged to Ottilie Bramble, a widow of 50 who lived alone in a small house at the edge of town. She stood in her doorway and looked at Adelaide for a long time before she stepped back to let her in. 12 years, the widow said, when they were sitting in her parlor. 12 years I have dreamed of a door in a hallway in that house. Every night that door opens. Every night the same man walks through it. 12 years. She put her thin hands flat on the parlor table. You believe that if I say it out loud in a courtroom that the door finally closes, she said. I do not know, said Adelaide. I know that the silence is the thing that has kept that door open. The widow looked at the table for a long time. Then she nodded. Tomorrow morning, she said. By midnight, Adelaide had knocked on 11 doors. 7 women had said yes. 4 had said no, and she had thanked them gently, and Asher had thanked them gently, and they had moved on. The Reverend Obadiah Finch was waiting for them on the steps of his church when they came back up the road in the very late hour. He had the parish book under his arm. He had been keeping it for 30 years, and in that book he had recorded in the careful hand of a man who took his confessions seriously every story that women had brought to him on his bench in the corner of the church and asked him to listen to and to keep. I have kept these in confidence, he said, because confidence was what they asked of me. I will give them up tomorrow. The Lord will know whether I did right. The Lord will also know what I did not do these 30 years by keeping them, and I will answer for that as well. The hearing was held the next morning in the largest room in Pinewood Gulch, which was the old assembly hall above the general store, because the courthouse itself was too small for what had come to town. Every seat was taken half an hour before Judge Halloran came in. Men stood 3 deep along the back wall. Children sat on the window sills with their legs hanging out into the morning sun. Bartholomew Driscoll sat at the plaintiff's table in a black wool coat and a starched white shirt, and his hands were folded on the table in front of him, as if he were attending a church service. Beside him sat Phineas Crowder of Denver, a lean man with a face like the edge of a knife. Behind them, in the back row of the gallery, sat United States Marshal Jericho Hardesty in a long, dust-colored coat with a federal badge on the lapel. At the defense table sat Rhett Brockway, walking with a cane now, with Adelaide on his right and Asher on his left, and Ridge standing against the wall behind them, because Ridge would not sit down in any room where his older brother was a target. Judge Prudence Halloran came in. She was 60 years old, and her hair was the color of January steel. She sat down at the bench and looked once around the room, and the room went silent. Mr. Crowder, she said, you may begin. Crowder began. He was good. He was very good. He spoke for 40 minutes. He laid out the writ for the annulment of the marriage on grounds of duress, citing the size of the men involved, and the youth of the bride and the unusual circumstance of her arrival. He laid out a federal warrant out of Montana Territory, dated June of 1870 for the murder of a Bozeman banker named Kingsley Mercer, and warrants for the same date for Asher Brockway and Ridge Brockway as accessories. He called for the arrest of all three brothers in the courtroom by United States Marshal Hardesty, and he called for the immediate transport of the prisoners to Helena for arraignment in front of a federal judge. He sat down. Marshal Hardesty stood up in the back of the room. "Your Honor," he said, "I am here in my federal capacity. I have a duly executed warrant. I respectfully request that the court permit me to take these three men into custody at this time." Adelaide stood up. She stood up before Judge Halloran could answer. She did not look at the marshal. She did not look at Driscoll. She did not look at the lawyer from Denver. She looked at the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "my name is Adelaide Penhallow Brockway. I am the wife of Rhett Brockway. I would like to be heard." Judge Halloran looked at her for a long moment. "The court will hear you, Mrs. Brockway." Adelaide put her hand into the hidden pocket of her dress and drew out two small leather books. She laid them carefully on the table in front of her. "This first book," she said, "is the memorandum book of my father, Ezra Penhallow, formerly a sergeant of scouts in the 6th United States Cavalry under General Philip Sheridan. He has kept this book for the last 6 months in Pinewood Gulch. In it, he has recorded every Confederate gold piece he has seen pass through the hand of Bartholomew Driscoll, and every man who has received one. He has also recorded a meeting in the cottonwoods south of Driscoll's ranch 3 months ago between Mr. Driscoll and a man named Ransom Falk. Mr. Falk is the leader of the Falk gang who were officially sentenced to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in 1874, and who have officially been in that penitentiary ever since." She paused. "Mr. Falk is not in Leavenworth," she said. "Mr. Falk is currently in the Pinewood Gulch jail with a bullet wound in his thigh, awaiting transport. He was taken alive on the side of Iron Bark Mountain 3 days ago, after he and 4 of his men attacked my home. My father has already prepared a deposition, stating that Bartholomew Driscoll has been hiding the Falk gang on his property for the last 4 months in exchange for Confederate gold from their old robberies." Phineas Crowder was on his feet. "Hearsay," he said, "wholly unsupported." Adelaide laid a hand on the second book. "This second book," she said, "belongs to Asher Brockway. It contains 6 years of notes taken by Mr. Brockway concerning every story he has heard in the town of Pinewood Gulch about Bartholomew Driscoll's household. It also contains, written this past Tuesday in this very town, the sworn testimony of one Jeb Quill, currently a prisoner of the county in which Mr. Quill states that Marshal Jericho Hardesty has been taking payment from Mr. Driscoll in Confederate gold for the past 2 years, and has been intercepting every wire sent by Sheriff Eldon Tate to the United States Marshal's office in Denver during that period, and is the reason no federal assistance has ever come to Pinewood Gulch." The room did not move. Marshal Hardesty's face had gone very white. "Crowder said, Your Honor, this is." "Sit down, Mr. Crowder," said Judge Halloran. He sat down. "Mrs. Brockway," said the judge, "is there more?" "There is more," Adelaide said. "There are 7 women in this room this morning who have agreed to testify under oath about what was done to them inside the house of Bartholomew Driscoll. There is the Reverend Obadiah Finch, who has agreed to bring forward 30 years of pastoral records on the same subject. I would respectfully ask that the court hear them before any warrant of any kind is executed against any man in this room." Judge Halloran looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Marshal Hardesty in the back of the room. "Marshal," she said, You will please sit down." He sat down. She heard them. She heard them all. She heard Maple Hennessy and Ottilie Bramble, and a girl of 18 named Phoebe Ackerman, who had run barefoot across an open pasture in the middle of the night 6 months ago to escape Driscoll's house. She heard Hattie Thurlow, who could remember exact dates from 12 years back, the way some women remembered the words of hymns. She heard Cordelia Wickham, whose sister Winifred had drowned herself in a well in 1872, rather than walk back into that house. She heard the Reverend Finch read in a voice that shook but never stopped 14 entries from his parish book. The room wept openly. Men stared at the floor. The men of Pinewood Gulch stared at the floor because they had known. They had always known. They had said nothing. When the last witness sat down, Phineas Crowder did not rise. He sat at his table with his hands folded in front of him and the color gone from his face, because he had understood somewhere in the third hour that he was no longer in a hearing about an annulment. He was in a hearing about the end of his client. Adelaide stood up one more time. "Mr. Driscoll," she said, "you wish to speak of duress. Let us speak of duress. My father is a Union veteran who carries on his coat the same medal that my husband carries on his. He was a scout for General Sheridan in the Shenandoah in '64. You have spent 11 years in this territory, sir, paying your bills with the gold of dead railroad guards and sheltering the men who killed those guards and breaking the women whose fathers owed you money. You have done all of it because you have not, sir, accepted that the war is over. General Robert E. Lee accepted it. General Lee laid down his sword at Appomattox in April of '65, and he ordered every man under his command to lay down his sword and go home. My husband was at Appomattox that day. He has more respect for General Lee than you do, sir, because when General Lee said the war was over, he meant it. 11 years later, sir, you are still fighting it, and my arrival in this town was the final piece you needed for a final attack. You did not want a housekeeper. You wanted a Yankee scout's daughter, and you wanted my father's memorandum book, and you wanted an ending." Bartholomew Driscoll came up out of his chair. His face was the color of an old wound. "You ungrateful little Yankee," he said. "Your father shot my brother at Cedar Creek in October of '64. The room went absolutely still. It was a confession dressed as an accusation, and every man and woman in that hall heard the difference. Driscoll's hand went inside his coat. Adelaide saw the small, flat shape of a derringer come out of the breast pocket, and she saw the muzzle come up, and she could not move fast enough. Rhett Brockway, who had been seated to her right, stood up out of his chair. He stood up between his wife and the gun. He did not duck. He did not throw himself sideways. He stood up to his full, enormous height in front of her, and he put his body between her and the muzzle of the derringer, and he said one sentence in a voice that carried clearly to the back of the room. "If you fire that piece, sir, you fire it through me first." Driscoll fired. The derringer cracked. Rhett went a half step back with the shock of it. The ball had taken him in the meat of the right shoulder, the same shoulder that had been put back together, once already on a kitchen table on ironbark. Sheriff Eldon Tate had his service revolver out of its holster before the smoke from the derringer had cleared the lawyer's table. He fired once, Driscoll went sideways into his chair with a piece of his own shoulder gone, and the derringer dropped onto the lawyer's table, and Phineas Crowder of Denver flinched away from it as if it were a snake. The room exploded into noise. Asher caught his older brother under the arms before he could fall. Adelaide caught his other side. Ridge was over the rail of the gallery in 2 strides with his Colt out, and he had Marshal Hardesty's wrist in one hand before the marshal had cleared his own coat. "Easy, Marshal," Ridge said. "Easy." Judge Halloran's gavel came down once, then again. Then a third time, and the room found its silence again under the slow, patient weight of her hand. "Sheriff Tate," she said, "you will arrest Mr. Driscoll on a charge of attempted murder in this court. You will arrest Marshal Hardesty on charges to be specified by myself and the federal court in Denver before sundown today. You will hold both men in your jail under the protection of every able man in this town. You will send a wire to Denver this afternoon, and you will personally watch the operator send it, and you will personally watch the operator receive any reply." Asher had pressed a folded handkerchief against his older brother's shoulder. Rhett's eyes were open. He was looking at Adelaide. "I told you," he said quietly. "I told you I was afraid of one thing only." She could not answer him because she couldn't yet trust her own voice. "Mr. Brockway," the judge said. Rhett Brockway turned his head toward the bench. "Yes, ma'am. There is a federal warrant out of Montana Territory in the matter of one Kingsley Mercer, deceased June of 1870. Mr. Crowder has placed that warrant before this court. Before I rule upon the petition of annulment, I would ask if you wish to address that warrant." Rhett looked at his wife. Then he looked at the judge. "I do," he said. He took his weight on his cane. He stood up alone away from his brother and his wife, because what he was about to say he did not want to say, leaning on anyone. "My name is Rhett Brockway," he said. "In June of 1870, in the city of Bozeman, in the territory of Montana, I walked into the parlor of the home of Mr. Kingsley Mercer in the middle of the afternoon. I laid the medal General Philip Sheridan pinned on me at Cedar Creek on a side table next to his coffee cup, so that he would know what kind of man had come for him. Then I shot him through the heart. He had purchased my 17-year-old sister, Junie, from our father in payment of a gambling debt 3 months earlier. And he had used her in his house in such a way that on the morning of April the 7th of that year, she hanged herself from a crossbeam in the room he kept her in with a bedsheet, with a note of 2 lines beside her on the pillow. I do not regret killing him. I did not regret it then, and I do not regret it now. I have lived with the warrant for 6 years on this mountain. I have not raised it in self-defense today because I do not wish to live the rest of my life as a man hiding from a thing he did. I would rather stand in front of this court, ma'am, and let the law do with me what the law will do." He sat down very slowly. Judge Prudence Halloran, 60 years old, daughter of an Iowa abolitionist and widow of a Union surgeon, looked at him for a long time across the courtroom. "The petition for annulment is denied," she said. "The marriage is upheld. It was lawfully entered into and freely chosen by the woman in question, and any reasonable observer in this room can see that for himself." She turned a page in front of her. "Mr. Driscoll will be held on the charges already named. Marshal Hardesty will be held pending federal review. The matter of the warrant from Montana Territory in the case of Mr. Brockway and his brothers will be deferred to a federal court of competent jurisdiction, and I will personally write to that court. and I will personally enclose the testimony given in this room today by Reverend Finch and Sheriff Tate and Sergeant Ezra Penhallow regarding the character and conduct of the deceased Mr. Mercer. I make no promises. I will say only that this court has heard in the past 4 hours more truth than it has heard in the past 4 years, and I do not believe any federal judge worth the name will fail to weigh that truth fairly. She set the gavel down without striking it. Mr. Brockway, she said, you will remain at liberty in the custody of your wife pending response from the federal court in Helena. Do not leave this territory. We have nowhere to go, ma'am, Rhett said. We are home. It was just past midnight that night when the second fight came. Adelaide was in the upstairs room at the boarding house of Mrs. Wendell Pruitt dressing the wound in her husband's shoulder, a second time with clean linen and witch hazel, when she heard a man cry out in the alley below the window. It was Ridge. She knew his voice the way she had come to know the voices of all 3 of them, because she had spent 3 months listening for them in a one-room cabin and a covered porch. The cry was short and contained. It was the sound of a man who had been hit, but not stopped. Asher was already past her down the stair. She held Rhett where he lay because Rhett could not run, because Rhett had a fresh ball in his shoulder and another older wound in his hip, and because she would not let him try. Stay, she said. The fighting in the alley took 90 seconds. She heard it through the window. She heard a knife on a knife. She heard a pistol fire twice. She heard a man fall against a barrel and curse in a low voice, and she heard Ridge Brockway say in a voice so calm, it was almost gentle, you do not get up from that one friend, you stay where you are. When she came down the back stair into the alley, Asher had a lantern in one hand and his other hand on Ridge's good shoulder. Ridge was leaning against the alley wall. There was a knife wound on the back of his left forearm and another on his thigh, and his shirt front was wet. At his feet lay Mungo Strawn, the last of the folk gang who had ridden out, who had come back into Pinewood Gulch wearing a freight clerk's coat over his pistol, because Marshal Hardesty had paid him that same evening from his cell to come over the back fence of the boarding house and find a way through Mrs. Pruitt's kitchen window and put a bullet in Bartholomew Driscoll before Driscoll could be made to talk in front of any federal court in the morning. 2 other men lay in the alley as well. One was dead. The other was sitting up against the boarding house wall with his hands tied behind him already, and a bandage wrapped around his head that Asher had put on while Ridge was still bleeding because Asher Brockway treated every wound he could reach, on every man he could reach every time. He had served at Elmira in '64, and he had not stopped serving since. The third man, the bound one, was talking. He was talking very fast. He was naming Hardesty. He was naming the room number. He was naming the time of the meeting. Asher had Ezra Penhallow's leather memorandum book open against his knee and was writing it down every word by the light of the lantern as it came out of the man's mouth. Adelaide knelt down beside Ridge and pressed her hand against the wound on his thigh. You are not going down on me, Ridge Brockway, she said. You hear me. We have come too far. He smiled at her. It was a tired fox smile, and it was the first smile he had given her that had no edge in it at all. I am not going down, he said. Not tonight. Tonight, I did a thing right. He closed his eyes for a moment and leaned his head back against the alley wall. "For Junie," he said quietly. She did not answer him. She just kept her hand on the wound and did not let it go. Hardesty was arrested in his cell within the hour. The boarding house woke. The town woke. By dawn, every door in Pinewood Gulch had a lamp burning behind it, and not one person in that town slept again that night, because the silence that had protected men like Driscoll for 11 years had finally cracked open, and the sound of it cracking open was loud enough to keep a whole town awake. The federal answer came 11 days later. A letter rider brought it up the trail at noon. He had ridden it from the wire office in Pinewood Gulch, where it had come over the line that morning from a federal court in Helena, Montana, and it was countersigned by a federal judge named Albright Crane. No relation to any other Crane in this story who had served as a Union surgeon in the same field hospital, where Asher Brockway had served as a hospital steward in 1864. The letter was short. It stated that the Federal Court of Montana Territory, having reviewed the affidavit of Judge Prudence Halloran, the testimony of Sheriff Eldon Tate, the parish records of Reverend Obadiah Finch, the deposition of Sergeant Ezra Penhallow, and the personal sworn statement of Rhett Brockway, and having further conducted an investigation into the conduct and history of the deceased Kingsley Mercer, that had revealed 6 other young women removed from their families in similar circumstances over a period of 7 years, had determined that the killing of Kingsley Mercer in June of 1870 was reclassifiable as a justifiable homicide in the defense of family honor. There would be no prosecution. There would be no extradition. The warrants against Rhett Brockway and Asher Brockway and Ridge Brockway were dismissed with prejudice. Ridge read the letter aloud on the porch because Rhett's hands were shaking too badly to hold the page steady. When Ridge reached the last line, he set the paper down on the porch rail, and he sat down on the top step of the porch, and he put his face into his hands, and he began to cry. He cried the way a man cries who has been holding a sound inside himself for 6 years and has finally been told he can let it go. Asher sat down beside him and did not speak. He simply put his arm across his younger brother's shoulders and held him there. His own eyes were wet, but he was not the first to fall, and he did not need to be. Rhett Brockway sat in the porch chair with the long brass medal of Cedar Creek in his hand, and he did not cry. He shook. He shook through his entire body, the way a great tree shakes in the first storm of a season. And Adelaide came and stood behind his chair and laid her hands on his shoulders. And she did not speak either because there were no words yet for what was happening on that porch. "It is over," she said at last. "It is over," he said. She bent down and laid her cheek against the top of his head. His hair smelled of pine smoke and gun oil, and the small, clean wind that came down off the high snowfields in the mornings. "Junie can rest now," she said, "and you can finally live." Ezra Penhallow lived through that winter and one more spring. He lived in a small, clean room that Adelaide rented for him in the back of the Reverend Finch's house, and he stopped drinking on the day the federal letter came, and he did not start again. He came up the trail to the cabin every Sunday for dinner. He helped Asher mend harness in the workshop. He sat on the porch with Ridge in the evenings, and they talked slowly at first and then more easily about horses and about scouting and about a war that had ended a long time ago, and that both men had still been carrying. On the morning of the 2nd of April in 1877, Reverend Finch found Ezra Penhallow lying on his back, in the small, clean bed, with both hands folded over his chest. The bronze medal of Cedar Creek lay on the quilt next to his right hand. He had not woken from sleep. Adelaide came down the mountain on Bramble. She sat beside her father's bed for a long time. Then she took the medal out of his hand and put it into the hidden pocket of her dress, beside her own mother's silver wedding ring, and she went back up the trail with both small, heavy things against her hip. She did not weep for the man she had once known who had failed her. She wept for the soldier who had ridden across 200 yards of open ground at Cedar Creek, with rebel skirmishers firing into the grass behind him, to free a 20-year-old sergeant from under a dead horse, and who had asked nothing afterward except, "Thank you, sir, my boy. Back yonder is all right." She hung the medal on the mantel over the fireplace at the cabin, beside the medal her husband had carried for 12 years, and she said to the 4 men present, both Brockways and her father's empty chair, "Let these 2 soldiers stand together in this room and watch over this house." The boy was born in the autumn of 1881. Maple Hennessy came up the mountain to attend her because a midwife from the town would not climb the Ironbark Trail for any money, and Maple climbed it for nothing. Ridge stood out on the porch for 9 hours with a piece of pine and a knife, and never made a single cut, only turned the wood over and over in his hands. Asher sat in the kitchen with a book open in front of him that he never turned a page of. Rhett stood at the bedroom door, and he did not move from the door for any of the 9 hours, and Maple finally opened it and said, "Sergeant, get in here, your son is here." His son. She named him Joseph Sheridan Brockway. Joseph for the grandfather who had broken under a war that had broken many men before him, but who had been a good Union soldier once before the breaking. Sheridan for the general who had pinned the bronze medal on his other grandfather on a cold field in the Shenandoah in October of 1864. Ridge cried openly at the bedside. Asher cried quietly with his face turned toward the window. Rhett, the man the territory had once called a devil, stood by the bed with his wife's hand in his, and he let the tears run down the long scar on his face, and he did not lift a finger to wipe them away. "He will not have to sell a sister," Rhett said. "He will not have to owe any man his life. He will be a man who stands straight. That is my oath." Asher and Ridge spoke at the same time. "That is our oath." It was on a morning in May of 1886, on Decoration Day in the town of Pinewood Gulch, that Adelaide Brockway watched her husband walk her son to the cemetery on the south side of the town, where the Union veterans were buried. Joseph Sheridan Brockway was 5 years old. He had his father's brass-colored eyes and his mother's mouth and his Uncle Ridge's quick fox grin. He wore pinned to the small wool coat his Aunt Maple had made him for his birthday, the bronze medal of Cedar Creek. The ribbon was faded almost white now. He carried in his small hand a bunch of wild flowers tied with a piece of butcher's twine, and his father had taught him in the week before Decoration Day that when a boy walked past the grave of a soldier, he took off his hat. Joseph walked beside his father in the long line of townspeople, and at the grave of Ezra Penhallow, Sergeant of Scouts, 6th United States Cavalry. He laid down the wild flowers and he took off his hat the way he had been taught, and Adelaide stood behind them with one hand pressed to her mouth. The Junie Brockway School for Boys on the south end of the town had taught its first class of 15 students that winter. The teacher was the Reverend Obadiah Finch. The schoolhouse had been built by Asher Brockway and Ridge Brockway in the summer of 1884. The Junie Society, an alliance of women across 3 counties that watched over young women coming alone into the territory, met every second Tuesday in the parlor of Maple Hennessy's small white house. And the 7 women who had stood up in Judge Halloran's hearing in 1876 were among its founding members. That evening, after the town had gone quiet and the boy had been put to bed, the 3 Brockway brothers stood together on the porch of the cabin on Ironbark, and the 3 of them did not speak for a long time. The peaks of the Ironbark Range stood silver under a high May moon. Down in the meadow, the creek moved softly over its stones, the way it had moved for 16 years now, the way it had moved for many human lifetimes before that. I did not think I would live to see 35, Rhett said at last. I never told either of you that. I thought the mountain would take me, or Montana would, or my own hand would on a bad night. I never told either of you that either. You did not have to said Asher. Junie would have liked her, said Rhett. Junie would have been jealous of her, said Ridge. He had grown into his face in the past 10 years. The fox grin was still there, but it was older now and it was kinder. She would have said, how come the oldest brother gets the smart, pretty wife, and the 2 of us are still up here freezing our backsides off? Asher laughed low and surprised. Rhett laughed with him. Adelaide came out onto the porch with a 4th tin cup of coffee in her hand. She gave it to Ridge, because Ridge was the one who had not gone in for his own. She came and stood beside her husband and laid her head on his shoulder, and the 4 of them looked out over the Ironbark Range together. Any regrets, she said. It was the question she asked every year on the anniversary of the wedding. It had become the only ceremony they kept. I regret that you had to come up that trail in the dust of that stagecoach, he said. I regret that Junie did not live to see the schoolhouse with her name on it. I regret that your father did not live to see the boy ride. About the rest of it, he paused. About the rest of it, no. Not for 1 second. Not ever. She rose on her toes and kissed the long scar on his face, the way she had kissed it every year on this same evening for 10 years. The small private right of 2 people who had agreed long ago that wounds could heal, even when they did not disappear. Behind them, through the open door, Asher had begun to read aloud from a book to no one in particular, because Asher Brockway read aloud in the evenings whether anyone was listening or not. And Ridge, on the far end of the porch, had begun to whistle very softly the slow tune of The Girl I Left Behind Me. It was the song the 6th Cavalry had marched to in the Shenandoah. It was the song his father had whistled before the war had broken him. It was the only song Ridge Brockway knew, and he whistled it every night on the porch of the cabin on Ironbark. And every night it meant the same thing, which was, I remember you, I carry you. You are still here. Adelaide Brockway closed her eyes. The code a man lives by, she said softly against her husband's shoulder. What is that, he said. It is when one soldier saves another at Cedar Creek in October of 1864. She said, and 12 years later that other soldier's daughter is kept safe by the man whose life he saved. It is when a man cannot save his sister and 6 years later he saves a stranger, because somebody must save somebody. It is when a husband stands up in front of a derringer for his wife without thinking. It is something that does not die, even after men have forgotten the war. She drew a long breath. My mother told me that knowledge was the only firearm a woman was permitted to carry, she said. She was wrong about that. There is one other thing. There is the love of men who live by a code. He put his arm around her shoulders. 3 men stood on the porch of a cabin on Ironbark Mountain, 16 years before in the summer, after their sister hanged herself in a banker's house in Montana. They had ridden up this mountain with nothing in the world but their saddles, and a federal warrant trailing them like a shadow. Tonight they were a family. Adelaide watched the moonlight move slowly down the western face of the range, and she thought, this is home. Not because anyone carried me here, because I found the road myself through fear and through gunfire and through a courtroom and through long winters and through grief, with 3 men beside me who gave me the most precious thing one human being can give another, the right to choose freely the life she would live. Joseph Sheridan Brockway, age 5, sleeping inside the cabin in a small bed that his Uncle Ridge had carved for him out of pine, did not yet understand any of what had been bought on his behalf before he was born. He had time. His mother and his father and his 2 uncles would tell him slowly in the right order, year by year, as he grew into the man he was gonna be, a man who would stand straight, a man who would not sell anyone, a man who would carry a code. The wind off the high snowfields came down across the Ironbark Range and lifted the loose hair at the back of Adelaide Brockway's neck, and she stood under that wind beside her husband. And she was no longer the girl who had stepped down from a stagecoach in a navy blue traveling dress in the summer of 1876. She was home.